John Barris Johnson, inaugurated this lecture series on a very high note. He's a hard act to follow. With some fear and trepidation, let me begin this year with a short story from the Hasidic tradition. A man was once heard repeating the alphabet in a synagogue. He then said, "Dear God, I don't know how to pray, yet with these poor letters of my alphabet, I'm sure that you can compose a really great prayer." Today, from these poor letters of my alphabet, I trust that you, my learned listeners, will be able to compose a fine lecture. It's an honor to be here today to give this the second in what we hope to be an annual lecture series entitled Confluence. The purpose of the lecture series is quite simple: to provoke thinking. Imagine that. And in so doing, inspire action and engender wholeness and integrity. I'm grateful that you have thought worth your while to be here today to listen to my thoughts on the topic of Canadian Unitarianism, an idea of a possibility. Perhaps you were curious about the title. It's not unique to me. Part of my recent sabbatical was spent visiting more than a dozen congregations. I did a very unministerial thing. I went to listen. I asked a lot of people what makes Canada, Canada, and what makes Unitarianism north of the 45th of the 49th parallel Canadian, much like the CUC Principles and Sources Task Force is now doing. Some people answered very personally, while others, claiming to speak for all, actually spoke for their particular spiritual, social, political subgroup, which they believed to define the center. Whether humanists, cosmologists, NDPer, environmentalist, pagan, or Christian, each tried with varying degrees of eloquence to define the challenged center. Neil Basundat said something like that about Canada itself. It was, however, Gilbert Bouchard, right here at Edmonton, who won the prize in my books. He answered, "Canadian Unitarianism is an idea of a possibility." Thanks, Gilbert. Your answer resonated with me and stimulated more than a little reflection. I can't say that my sabbatical research was particularly methodical. It's not my style. I'm neither historian nor sociologist. I'm a preacher. And in every preacher, there's a bit of a provocateur. So this morning, I want to provoke you. I want to provoke you into thinking, into a little discussion. What you will hear will be a combination of my thinking, reading, living, and quite frankly, my best guesses, accumulated over 25 years of ordained ministry. My apologies at the outset to those of you who are way ahead of me in thinking through these matters. Be kind. I'll put your name on a sign-up sheet for a future lecture. Now, I've been told that the best lectures are those in which the presenter first tells the audience what's going to be said, then says it, only to end by restating what has already been said. So let me begin this morning by outlining an hypothesis or two that I want to work with. Firstly, I will argue that in much of our history and even today, Canadian Unitarian congregations have lived far too convergent with the mainstream of Canadian values and culture, rather than living as a much-needed confluent, challenging, or counterculture force. I will try to show that sociologically our congregations have paralleled Canadian society despite our rhetoric. When it was conservative, so were we, and now we're both mildly liberal. Since today our theological divergence has all but disappeared, and since many of our liberal social action positions parallel those of the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops or the United Church of Canada, I want us to ask ourselves whether there is any possible room left for growth. and whether perhaps there's any justification for our separate existence. Max Weber reminded us that all institutions are somewhere on their way from the original storm to a slow death by suffocation. Where are we on that path? Secondly, I'll argue that there is a dichotomy within our Canadian Unitarian movement. Although we speak of diversity and embracing respectful engagement, our congregations are, for the most part, value tribes, which promote specific, value-laden liberal agendas or ideologies. We are, in fact, an exclusive tribe. Perhaps we should become more exclusive. Thirdly, good preachers always have 3 points. I will argue that for us to survive and maybe even thrive, we must break loose from the past and make wide-ranging changes in our being, believing, and behavior. I will trace 2 paths which lie before us as possibilities. Following one, we would become more sharply dissonant, more extreme socially and politically. Following the other, we would move beyond religion altogether and become transformative in a spiritual way. I will argue that we should move in this latter direction and away from being mere social change activists or a lobby group for liberal values. I will argue that we should move towards becoming what Tom Attlee has called facilitators of cultural transformation. This shift will, I believe, unlock possibilities that lie hidden within this great idea called Unitarianism. So as you see, we're going to cover a bit of territory this morning, so hang on. Let's begin. Confluence. Isn't that a great name for a lecture series? In 1886, then Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier described Canada as confluence. I quote, "Below the island of Montreal, the waters that come from the north unite with the waters that come from the western lakes, but uniting they do not mix. There they run parallel, separate, distinguishable, and yet as one stream, flowing within the same banks, the mighty St. Lawrence, a perfect image of our nation." End of quote. What intrigues me about this statement is that Laurier could have been speaking about Canadian Unitarians. Confluent streams flowing together, parallel, separate, distinguishable within one body. We are, indeed, diverse theological and sociological streams of Irish, English, American loyalists, Icelander, European refugee, and even a few Canadians, though not enough Canadiens, flowing separately and harmoniously together between the wide and welcoming banks of this great river called Canadian Unitarianism. The image is appealing. Does it, however, accurately describe who we are? Confluence can also mean running into each other. Rather than the mighty St. Lawrence, this word brings to my mind the Tobique River in New Brunswick, where I have a cabin. Last summer, after many days of heavy rain, half of the river turned brown. Deforestation had eroded the soil, and fish-killing guck flowed downstream. Below the surface, I pictured a life and death struggle, as one stream fought desperately to keep separate and distinguishable from the other, while the latter fought equally hard to control the whole river. Might this rendition of the image not better describe our experiences within Unitarianism? Confluence is then a more complex self-image or conceptual map than it first appears. It's easy to get lost in the splendor of the image without much thought for its accuracy. Canada and Unitarians share this fascination with conceptual mapping, and equally share an indifference, if not an antagonism, towards exploring the actual details of the territory. The explorer, David Thompson, is considered a map maker of the Canadian mind. He walked this country 80,000 kilometers on foot, in canoe, and by dog sled. Yet at the end of his life, nobody wanted to buy his maps. Cheryl Grace, in her book, Canada and the Idea of North, states that the myth of Nordicity shapes and haunts Canada, even as ironically we huddle in the warm south close to the US border. The idea of North informs our Canadian psyche, yet learning about the actual North, its people and traditions, and traveling to the North is met with great resistance. Don't ruin a good self-image or a concept by pointing out where it doesn't fit the map. Similarly, many of us resist Philip Hewitt's cajoling us to dig more deeply into the details of our Canadian Unitarian and Universalist histories. Leave us with our precious images, Philip. Don't confuse us with the topographical details. Obviously, this is problematic. Images and conceptual maps constitute and shape cultural mythology. False and inaccurate maps only lead us astray. As Canadian historian P.B. Waite has said, the mapping of history is a false order imposed upon an immensely complicated reality. It's an arbitrary and doubtless haphazard selection of what really was. So this morning, I want to impose another arbitrary order on our past in an attempt to open up new possibilities for our future. I will step out of my usual role, that of cheerleader for things Canadian and Unitarian, assume that I've already said all of the good stuff and piled on all the warm fuzzies about us. My time is short, and I want to focus on the critique, not just to be negative, but out of a belief that this movement of ours is precious and holds within it an idea full of great possibilities, many of which we have not yet explored. So, when we do draw a map, a conceptual map of ourselves, how do we usually position Unitarians on the religious landscape? Do we not usually describe ourselves as intellectuals, liberals, and free thinkers, who, not bound by tradition, affirm and promote progressive and avant-garde values? We take pride in being ahead of the social and theological trends. We like to think of ourselves as a movement that pushes against the theological and social conservatism of Canadian society, a movement that accepts diversity, that fights against homogenization, and challenges the establishment. Does the map fit the territory? Not easily. Even though in the past Canadian Unitarians have been described as foreigners trying to undermine the traditional respectable patterns of Canadian life, from what I've observed and read, it seems to me that our Unitarian congregations have been très canadiens, sinon trop canadiens. Michael Adams, for example, describes Canadians as a tolerant people, socially liberal and flexible, who find their path by their own thinking. Très canadien, n'est-ce pas? I would argue that our self-image is at odds with the reality. This is so in part because we have focused far too much on outspoken individuals and have ignored evidence coming from our congregational cultures. Has not much of our cherished self-image of radicalism been borrowed from American Unitarians, those literal, mostly well-heeled and famous American UUs who gave shape not only to Unitarianism, but also to American society? How much? How much of our self-image would remain if we subtracted these more outspoken ministers from among us and focused upon our congregations and their behaviors? Certainly in Canada, we have had some remarkable individuals, some characters also. Elizabeth Hedge, Elizabeth Cushing, William Irving, Margaret Lawrence, Angus Cameron, Dorothy Livesey, John Molson, Emily Stowe, the Workmans, Philip Hewitt, Charles Edis, and others. You know the list. We've even had a few of the rich and influential among us. Yet, many of those who had been Unitarians back home, or who simply shared Unitarian ideals, seem to stay at arm's length from our congregations. Individuals such as Supreme Court Justice Wilfred Judson, Dorothy Livesey, and Margaret Lawrence. American UUs have had much the same problem. Benjamin Franklin, we're told, faithfully stayed away from all the congregations that he supported financially, Presbyterian, Unitarian, and Episcopal alike. Other noteworthy Canadians seem to have drifted through our congregations and our ministry, such as William Irvin, Francis Potter, and Harold Rosen. We must ask ourselves, what was it about us that made them stay at a distance or leave altogether? It's too simple and probably a rationalization at best to blame their departure on our radicalism. Were our congregations all that non-mainstream? It seems not. Others have said this before me, but it bears repeating so that we're on the same map, as it were. In Canada, Unitarians were not the establishment. Most of our members came as either political or economic refugees. Many came from what was called the evening congregations, comprised of working class people who had little interest in intellectual matters and less ability in leadership. Most of the real theological and political revolutionaries went to the United States. Canadian Unitarians were mostly pioneers, hence the theme of this weekend. We must be careful, though, not to romanticize the idea of pioneer, whose daily reality is hardly recognizable in the popular image. Most pioneers were seeking a better life for themselves and were not interested in rocking the boat. Survival issues were omnipresent. Perhaps this is why, in so many of our congregational stories, survival issues are predominant. To quote Unitarians in Canada, our congregations were, for the most part, less eager for change than were their ministers, and tended to put up considerable resistance to any radical alterations, even in their accustomed orders of service. In both English and French Canada, people were seeking to preserve their values and cultures and reacted against liberal revolutions. Like the larger Canadian society, Unitarian congregations were full of great caution, reserve, and restraint. Does this not ring true of your experience within your congregation? It seems that until recently, Unitarian congregations as a whole did not take formal stands on anything, although they safeguarded their ministers' right to do so. While a few individuals were revolutionary, our congregations and membership were for the most part apolitical and reflected the views of the dominant culture in Canada. Let me give you a few examples. During the First World War, the Reverend Frederick Griffin in Montreal spoke out for pacifism, while William Irvin in Calgary for conscription of wealth. While most of the members of our congregation, like in other Protestant churches, rose to patriotic fervor. Here in Edmonton, Unitarian layman William Hardy Alexander tried to purge the movement of anyone not wholeheartedly supporting the war. Today, many Canadians, and the majority in Quebec, are opposed to war. So are most Unitarians. Where were our congregations on the issue of democratic reforms in the 19th century? Montreal is always credited with being on the conservative end of things, and most often we deserve the reputation. In Montreal, for example, there was almost a split in the congregation even before it was founded over the 1837-1838 rebellion, as it was framed by the winners. You will remember that these conflicts in both Lower and Upper Canada were attempts to bring about much-needed democratic reforms. John Cordner and most of the congregation in Montreal were against such reforms. The situation was much the same back in the Ireland that Cordner had just left, namely conservative congregations and outspoken individuals. I want to mention a distant relative in this regard, not to boast, of course, William Drennan, son of a Belfast 18th century non-subscribing Presbyterian minister Thomas Drennan, was arrested and tried for treason in the 1798 rebellion. I'm happy to report that he wasn't hung. The family has enough skeletons as it is. William Drennan, though, dared to challenge the social inequalities of his days and promoted fundamental democratic reforms. Reforms similar to the ones that Cordner and the Montreal congregation wanted no part of 40 years later. Where were our congregations on the question of immigration? It seems that for the most part we were just as ethnocentric as Canada itself. Not all that long ago, Canadian immigration policies were written by white British Christians. These policies denied entrance to those who couldn't be easily molded into good Canadians, and by that was understood good Christians. Canadian churches, ours included, promoted a melting pot through what Canadian historian W.L. Morton has called internal Canadian imperialism by the so-called centre. One reminder of this will suffice. In the spring of 1914, the Komagata Maru, with 376 Sikhs on board, sailed into Vancouver Harbour, directly from India, to challenge the Canadian racially motivated law of direct passage. They were not permitted to land. In July, the HMCS Rainbow, half of Canada's Navy at the time, with soldiers pointing fixed bayonets at unarmed passengers and Sikhs reciting the Guru Granth Sahib, ejected them from Canadian waters. It is a shameful moment in our history. In preparation for this lecture, I read through the microfilm record of the Unitarian Church of Vancouver, and in particular the Board of Trustees' annual report of February 1915. 7 months after this scandal, there was no record of the church's position on the matter. Maybe I missed it, but there was an interminable silence as the congregation seemed self-absorbed with its deficit, with congratulating itself on a new classroom that it just completed in the basement, and with trying to establish a more dignified position for itself in the community. So where did our congregations position themselves on the social gospel movement in Canada? New England Unitarians had influenced Salem Bland, the philosopher and later mentor of the movement. The emerging religion of labor, as Wordsworth expressed it, was more a reflection of the culture of a Canadian intellectual than a Canadian worker. This should have made it even more appealing to us. But why did we not become the labor church? Any reading in depth of J.S. Wordsworth's speeches will tell us why. The labor church promoted fundamental social change. It was socially radical. Unitarians were merely theologically liberal. Liberalism talks about change all the while guarding social and political privilege. Of late, through the CUC, Unitarian congregations have made some important social justice statements. We have spoken out for choice and act of dying, First Nations, peace and disarmament, reproductive rights, the environment, and same-sex marriage. Valuable as these declarations are, they seldom affect our mortgages or our RSPs. Most of them, in fact, are variations of statements made by the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops or by Kairos. On the same-sex marriage issue, our official position differs little from that of the United Church of Canada or liberal Anglicans. Here again, we reflect Canadian opinion. It's been just reported that 47% of Canadians are now in favor of same-sex marriage, while in the US, the figure stands at 36%. Reginald Bibby recently said that the reason Canadians are more accepting of same-sex marriage than Americans is due in part to the fact that Canadians attend church less often. To be honest, if we scratch below the surface in our congregations, will we not discover a wide range of opinions on all of these subjects, perhaps a reflection of the larger Canadian society? In this light, Philip Hewitt's book, Unitarians in Canada, is perhaps an attempt to explain our bewilderment. If Unitarianism is so Canadian, how is it that we have not been such a rip-roaring wild success here? We must admit it. Our congregations have for some time now been mainstream and respectable. In Montreal in 1917, Reverend Griffin could say, "Our church is respected." Today, even the feisty Winnipeg congregation has moved into a swanky new building in a posh neighborhood. In some of my more cynical moments, yes, even ministers get these, it appears to me that we Unitarians have 8 principles. On too many days, the first and sadly the foremost reads, we affirm and promote a respectable image for ourselves at all costs. Might we not trace some of our problems around the G word, no, not God, but growth, back to this shift towards respectability? Must we not admit, too, that our congregations and our movement have been timid creatures? Rather than bravely and willingly go where no other group has dared to venture before, too often we've had to be pushed. Would Unitarianism ever have happened in England had the Independents, the General Baptists, and the rigorous academic and independently minded Presbyterians who didn't like each other very much not been pushed out and pushed in together by the Act of Uniformity in 1662? Would the Montreal congregation ever have left that drafty, much in need of repair building, a building that better reflected Anglicanism than Unitarianism, had we been not pushed out by the fire? And would we be here today? An independent Canadian movement had John Buren's and the UUA not pushed us. Maybe we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. David Bumbaugh once said, even the most liberal of religions performs an essentially conservative function, seeking to preserve the best of the past, functioning as a secure anchor in the ebbing and flowing tides of change and decay. At this stage of my lecture, I feel that I should maybe stop and sing a chorus from Alice's Restaurant. Remember that song written by Arlo Guthrie? you might be in need of an intermission. I wanted to get a Canadian tune, but neither the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald nor Northwest Passage seemed to fit what I wanted to say, so Alice's Restaurant will have to do. You remember the song? You can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant. You can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant. Walk right in, it's around the back, just a half a mile from the railroad track. You can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant. Well, about halfway through his 18-minute and 20-second song, after having told us all about Alice and the restaurant and all about the garbage and Officer Obie and the 27 8x10 colored glossy pictures with the circles and the arrows and the paragraph on the back of each one, Guthrie stopped and said, "But that's not what I came to talk to you about. I came to talk to you about the draft." Well, all that I've been saying so far about the past is not what I came to talk to you about. I came to talk to you about our future. If what I've been saying describes something important about where we've been, where might we go from here? I want us now to focus on the two remaining hypotheses that I mentioned at the beginning. The one talks about that dichotomy, and the other outlines possible paths for the future. As I thought about our future as a movement, and I have thought a great deal about it since hitching my wagon to this caravan, it seems to me that there are two very different, often conflicting concepts of how we organize ourselves. Too often it seems that we preach one while we live the other, and it tends to make us all a bit mixed up. These two concepts offer the possibility of three paths for our future as congregations and as an association of congregations. I certainly hope that we never become a denomination. The two concepts and three paths address in different ways the fundamental questions of how we claim our identity, how we manage our differences, and how we act in the world. Let me briefly outline the paths, for I want to dispense with one immediately. On the first path, we would become an alternative religion, a more distinct value tribe, as it were. On the second path, we would become an alternative to religion, a center for personal and cultural transformation. The third path would set up a creative tension between the first two paths, much like in polarity mapping. Now, I'm going to leave the exploration of that third path for someone else. For the time that is remaining, I want to focus on paths 1 and 2. So, on this first path, we would become an alternative religion, gathered around clearly defined constellations of ideas or positions. This may seem like where we are now, but as I go along, it will become more obvious why I don't believe that we're there yet. Most of our congregations declare a belief in complexity and honor a diversity of opinions. Most of us say that we gather around our principles in a general enough way so as to allow a multitude of interpretations or applications of them. In theory, we hope that someone justifying military intervention in Iraq and a pacifist could be at home equally in our congregation and claim the center. That's in theory. It doesn't seem to be working out that way. This is where that dichotomy comes in. It seems that in many of our congregations, we've gone beyond generalities and gather around specific interpretations of the principles to which everyone ought to agree, that is, if they are really Unitarian. In some cases, it might not be too strong to call these constellation of ideas, opinions, and behaviors ideologies, whether we acknowledge them or not. Too often our congregations define their center and their values with a certain rigidity. Kathleen Hunter once said that we promote rigid political views, alienating the money to people. Now, I'm sure that each of you could come up with your own list of views and ideas and behaviors that might form these constellations within our Unitarian value tribe. They might, to name a few, include promoting pacifism, anti-globalization, being green, wearing Birkenstocks, not wearing suits, voting NDP, supporting the CBC, not talking to strangers at coffee, promoting gay marriage, and not driving SUVs, at least not into the church parking lot. On that last one, I've already requested a special dispensation from my congregation. Because my gas-guzzling big Roadmaster station wagon is over 11 years old, and they know they don't pay me enough money to buy a hybrid. One brave soul in Calgary, having come from an African experience, came right out and said it. We Unitarians, we are a tribe. If you don't think that we are, take a moment and look around the room today. Though we speak of diversity and inclusion, we unintentionally exclude. We are a value tribe. For this reason, I would respectfully take issue with John Barris Johnson's contention in last year's lecture. John said that we can be distinguished from other religious groups because their leaders speak in ways that are intended to shut down the conversation of faith. I would contend that we equally shut down the conversations in our congregations. If someone believes in applying our principles in a fashion contrary to the majority, would that person's views be warmly welcomed into the center of the congregation? More often than not, we leave little room for such people and their views at the center. They are left to feel, at best, tolerated or patronized. We often shut down their ideas and force them into the closet, either fit in, conform, be cantankerous, or leave, and form your own Unitarian congregation down the street. No doubt the plan would be to enshrine your own constellation of ideas at the center of this brand spanking new Unitarian congregation. Now, most of us are painfully aware of this. So what can we do about it? If we wish to remain a religion, and later I'll argue that we shouldn't, but if we wish to remain a religion, I believe that we should stop beating ourselves up over the fact that we are, for the most part, a politically, socially, and economically defined value tribe. Exclusion, after all, is a necessary part of being a religion. Religions are, by definition, particular, tribal, cultural, and exclusive. We drive ourselves crazy feeling guilty for this lack of diversity among us. Maybe we should just accept the fact that as a religion, even an alternative religion, we too are tribal, and therefore, to some degree, exclusive. Of course, simply admitting that we are exclusive and tribal doesn't mean that we have to foster tribalism. As a faith tribe, we can meet other faith tribes and honor the other that is present with humility. Sadly, our Unitarian tribe has been a little short on that quality. There are, of course, positive benefits to being a tribal religion. Being together with like-minded tribesmen or tribeswomen is one of the reasons why our members continue to belong and participate, regardless of the quality of the sermon or the coffee. I'm asking that we come clean about our biases and not flog idealistic diversity. In an age such as ours, when the Canadian religious and political right and especially a group called the Center for Cultural Renewal, when this right is getting better organized and seeking to control more of the public square in Canada, it could be argued that Canada is more than ever in need of a tribal religious group like ours, which hangs out on the liberal value edge, freely and openly gathering around liberal applications of the principles. Charles Francis Potter, one-time minister here in Edmonton, said, "My main occupation during my ministry in liberal churches has been the often unsuccessful attempt to persuade the members to try to become really and broadly liberal." So as a value tribe, as an alternative religion, where might this path lead us? We could stay much as we are, liberal, relatively affluent, respectable, continuing to say the left things about Bush and the environment. There is, of course, a downside to staying the way we are. I wonder if staying as we are would give us much of a future. Our future might become as bleak as the one described in the book The End of History. I quote, "Daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculations, the endless solving of technical problems, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands." Someday that future seems closer than I wish to acknowledge. The problem is, if we stay much as we are, I don't see how we can expect much growth in numbers. I say this for two reasons. Firstly, sociologists are telling us that to the degree that a religious organization lives norms and values different from those of the surrounding culture, it is called deviant. For a religious institution to grow, there must be a certain level of dissonance or deviancy. Most mainline denominations and Unitarians are not really growing. The sociologist tells us this is partly because there isn't sufficient dissonance between us and the mainline culture. We've already talked about that. But this second reason is also important. The second reason for lack of growth potential as we are has to do with our place on the Canadian religious landscape. In so many ways, we do not differ all that much from the United Church of Canada, with its broad interpretation of faith and its liberal social agenda. If someone is looking for a place reflecting moderate liberal religious values within a respectable institution, there's usually a United Church which will satisfy them. What room is there left for us? Let me take our discussion a little further. This path holds another option. As a tribal religion, we need to ask ourselves a few troubling questions. Are the liberal values that our tribe promotes adequate? In which ways do these liberal values promote genuine social justice? And in which ways do they simply prop up the status quo that favors our privilege as well-heeled, armchair, socialist capitalists with good intentions? This path would call us to take a bold step. So let me be bold for a moment. I would suggest that if we wish to remain a cultural, value-specific tribal religion, then we will need to move to an even less inclusive position. Yes, you heard me correctly. To a less inclusive position. We would need to become a more exclusive and more dissonant or radical value tribe. We would need to sharpen our social and political positions, moving from mildly liberal to counterculture or radical. For over 20 years, Gregory Baum has been encouraging the churches to move in this radical direction. He says, "The mainstream of Canadian society nurtures a culture of injustice. It is comfortable with the status quo. Since most theologians and churches belong to the middle class, in order to be faithful, they, the ministers and the churches, have to opt against the perspective of their own class. Theology and the church must become counterculture. Living as a counterculture radical religion would affect the way we live and spend and invest and holiday." The CUC from 1969 to 1996 outlined a roadmap for such a counterculture religion in their statement on economic justice. We, however, along with most of the Canadian churches, simply mouthed the correct platitudes regarding a preferential option for the poor. It was the in-language of the time. Yet we did not significantly change our place of privilege. Let me suggest one example of how such a countercultural religious tribe might act. Our Unitarian congregations could, for example, lobby the federal government to tax all religious institutions, including our own, much like the Mennonites did in the United States. Once we achieved this right, we could then withhold our taxes in protest. Protest against increased military spending, environmental destruction, and systemic injustice. A countercultural religious organization would act even at the risk of losing its buildings and its charitable status. Ironically, there was a short time when the Edmonton Church was the only church in North America which paid taxes. They could have been the first to have withheld them. It's time for another chorus of Alice's Restaurant. Since all that I have said so far is really a preparation for what I've come to talk to you about. This final path is what I want to leave with you, for I believe within it is the key to unlocking the revolutionary possibilities within the idea that is Unitarianism. Quite frankly, given our history, I wonder how possible it would be for our congregations and our movement to become that countercultural, religious, political, and social group. This second path encourages us to move in a different direction, namely to a truly revolutionary spiritual position. Following this path, we would move beyond a mere lobby group for liberal values and beyond social change activists. On this path, we would move beyond religion altogether and fully claim our identity, that of being not a real religion, ironically within a land that has been described as not a real country. This second path holds great possibilities, and elements of it have been among us for years, though we've merely toyed with them. We've often spoken of holding content at arm's length and of emphasizing the search and the process. Our foundational work with WCRP and IARF has included parts of the path. For the last 40 years, we have been aware that having so many converts among us keeps us preoccupied with matters of belief and religion as doctrine in the very group that declares that these are not the essence of religion. When leaving the Montreal Church in 1959, Angus Cameron hinted at this path when he said, "The question is not merely what you do or do not believe. The question is how. In what spirit do you now approach the problems and questions and issues of life?" Yes, elements of this path have been among us, yet for the most part have remained an unexplored territory. Our congregations have seemed unable or unwilling to break free from their generic Protestant culture, our NDP at meditation position. We seem to have been more than a little afraid of the revolutionary implications of this call beyond religion, a little afraid of becoming tumbleweeds. If some in our congregations are not yet used to the idea that we have gone beyond Christianity, obviously there's a little consternation at the thought of moving beyond religion. So we've merely toyed with the idea and the path. Each time we've come to the brink and looked over the edge towards future possibilities, we have backed away, somewhat desperate to find or to force a consensus of content which would define our center. We must be careful as we proceed with the work of the Principles and Sources Task Force that such desperation does not drive us again. Personally, I do not believe the center of our movement or our congregations, formed around consensus on substantive issues, is achievable, important, or productive. It may even be a betrayal of the revolutionary idea that we are. Let me unpack that sentence. In order to embrace fully the possibilities inherent within this path beyond religion, we would need to leave behind once and for all the idea that we are a church, even a liberal, avant-garde, postmodern church. We would need to work out our feelings about this, and there seem to be many. We would need to honestly admit that we are no longer a religion. The good news is that there are few people out there looking for a religion. We would need to admit that we no longer have a faith. We would have to stop using such language. Boldly, we would empty the center of any hope of consensus or of the pet orthodoxies that seem to sneak in. No constellation of opinions, no social programs, no matter how noble, not even being green or anti-war or anti-globalization, no beliefs, opinions, political positions, ideologies, or theologies should sneak into the center of our movement. Even diversity itself would not be the center. Simply being diverse and complex is no guarantee of anything. A zoo, after all, is a diverse and complex place. Yet I hope there is some difference between a zoo and a Unitarian congregation, although some days I wonder. You might be asking, Ray, what's left? What's left when the center has been emptied? I would say that only when the center is truly empty can the full possibilities of deep spirituality enter among us. Let me repeat that. Only when the center is truly empty can the full possibilities of deep spirituality enter among us. The Tao Te Ching speaks of this. It says, "It is empty, yet infinitely capable. It is like the eternal void filled with infinite possibilities." The center of our movement could become that empty fullness filled with infinite possibilities. Beliefs and opinions and social justice positions have no place defining our collective center or identity. Content is not the issue. Process is. How we hold our opinions and beliefs and exchange them with others is the issue. Within our congregations, gathering in this empty, full space of respectful engagement, the military person and the pacifist, the gay marriage supporter and non-supporter, the universal and private sector Medicare people, the humanist and the Christian, would feel that their perspectives were equally heard and equally valid. Each would be honored as they were. Each would be challenged to become all that they might be. Each would find a place of deep dialogue and exchange, and no shoulds as to how to interpret or implement rules collectively or practically would enter. There might be no principles at all, but simply rules of engagement or covenants of behavior. Imagine what might happen if we left to one side our collective tribal, generic Protestant identity, left to one side our collective political, social, theological, and ideological positions, so as to engage with each other in an open space of empty fullness. Obviously, on this path, our structures, both local and national, would need to be transformed. No longer would we spend our time facilitating, often forcing, consensus around social issues. The CUC, our annual meetings, our regional gatherings, would have as their mandate to protect and to nurture that open space in which deep dialogue and personal transformation could occur. The purpose, the sole purpose of our gatherings would be dialogue and personal transformation, as each is invited to become their whole and holy self. Maybe then we could truly become the quintessential boomer religious community without the narcissism that too often accompanies it. In his recent visit to Ottawa, the Dalai Lama said that the next century should be the century of dialogue. We could become the community of dialogue. How sad that in our global societies, meanness and violence, rather than respectful dialogue, seems to have triumphed. How tragic that in our world it's considered spiritually naive or radical or counterculture to promote politeness, random acts of kindness, respectful engagement, dialogue, reverence for difference, and amicable collision. I like that final phrase, amicable collision. It takes us back to our roots and to two non-subscribing Presbyterian ministers, Thomas Drennan, whom I mentioned earlier, and his good friend Francis Hutcheson, the father of Scottish Enlightenment. Both these men were greatly influenced by Lord Shaftesbury, who in the 18th century coined that term, amicable collision. Shaftesbury wrote these words: politeness, kindness, compassion, self-restraint, and a sense of humor are the final fruits of a polished culture. We polish one another and rub off our rough corners and rough sides by a sort of amicable collision. To restrain this is inevitably to bring a rust upon our understanding. Such amicable collision doesn't mean snuffing out and smoothing over disagreements, but rather opening up spaces that are safe enough for critique, appreciative listening, and communion. Within a safe and open space, we could experiment with how to honor deep dialogue and otherness. What, after all, is more sacred than communion with otherness? Entering the holy of holies of another person's hopes and dreams and loves and losses. Is that not the sign of a deeply spiritual and mature movement? What is spirituality, after all, but that which connects one to all that is? Honoring otherness has always been the central aspect of authentic spirituality, the place of deep and nourishing spirit. Although we've too often deflected it onto a transcendent being, rather than exploring it within the human family. Need we look any further for our Unitarian and Universalist identity? On this path, when we have moved beyond religion, our identity would simply be the way we invite others into respectful engagement. Our identity would be that of dialogue and bridge building. We would be known as a place where opinions may be heard and greater understanding possible, where inclusive structures are birthed. Is that not a revolutionary idea? Paul Woodruff said it this way: we may be divided from one another by our beliefs, but never by reverence. If you desire peace in the world, do not pray that everyone share your beliefs. Pray instead that all may be reverent. Wouldn't it be great if when people thought of Unitarians, they thought of reverential engagement leading to transformation? Now I know that some of you are arguing with me here. Ray, such a path would merely turn us into a debating club, a club that fiddles as our global community burns. I would ask you to stop for a moment and to reflect. Where do you believe that hope for humanity lies? Do you truly believe that hope for this planet and for all its living beings lies in partisan politics and lobby groups that cajole and manipulate the political agenda through shouting the loudest or through money or through military might? Surely we've seen where such partisan politics leads us. Traditional, value-based tribal religions, which have been duped into becoming mere voices for partisan politics, have become part of the problem and not the solution. And we Unitarians, we too are part of the problem if we believe that our ideas, our way of being, and our truth, enlightened of course, is the only answer, the one size that fits all. Does the world really need another tiny, religious-based lobby group? There are lots of other groups around that are much more effective than we. Does the true hope for humanity not rest in the possibility that we can learn to understand and to celebrate the diversity that we are? Doesn't the hope for humanity lie in the possibility that human beings will find the wisdom to enter into deep dialogue and human communion across vast differences from which truly respectful and inclusive structures of being together on this tiny, interrelated planet can emerge? Is this open space not the essence of deep spirituality, the birthplace of peace and justice? Harrison Owen said it this way: the depth of love is measured by the breadth of open space. An entire lecture could be devoted to that one sentence. Rather than sitting in our ivory towers, wordsmithing social justice positions, might our congregations not be turned into centers of deep dialogue and personal transformation, into training grounds for facilitators of cultural transformation? Our communities then would send out individuals, transformed and equipped, who within effective coalitions could transform society into respectful communities of inclusion and justice. Within Unitarianism, there is the seed of that possibility. We could become known as a place where spirit is strong. I must end here. It was George Erasmus, commenting upon the LaFontaine and Baldwin era of Canadian history, who said, "Creating and sustaining a national community is an ongoing act of imagination, fueled by the stories of who we are." I hope that my alphabet today of paths and ideas has stirred your imagination, helped provoke your thinking, and will inspire you to act, if just a little. Let me now sum up what I've said. I believe that Unitarians have lived too convergent within the mainstream of Canadian values and cultures, rather than living as a much-needed, confluent, challenging counterculture force. As I see it, the status quo won't do, for it offers little room for growth, vitality. I've suggested two paths which we might follow into the future. One challenges us to leave behind our mildly liberal agenda and transform ourselves into a more distinctive counterculture and radical value tribe, both politically and socially. As I've said, I doubt we can do this. Path 2 challenges us to boldly move beyond religion altogether and to dare to gather spiritually in a transformative way. I believe that this second path offers us the best chance of success. Canada and our world needs spiritual forums and open spaces of deep dialogue to effectively communicate across vast differences of land, philosophy, culture, and belief. In this idea rests vast possibilities. But how might we get there? How might we move beyond where we are and start out on the path? We could wait. We could wait until we are pushed once again, though there's no telling what shape our movement or our world might be in by then. There doesn't seem to be an easy way into it. It most probably would require us simply to jump into it. Nearly every advance of the human species has been that leap in the dark. Whether it was that first creature which crawled onto land or the first person who tried to fly, it begins by imagining it. May we together in this movement learn how to imagine boldly, and then to leap, and then to fly. May we imagine ourselves into the future. May we imagine ourselves anew in order to bring to birth in this land more of the possibilities inherent within the dynamic idea of Canadian Unitarianism. Our survival as a country and as a species, and maybe the survival of our tiny, fragile, and interrelated planet may depend on humanity imagining the possibilities inherent in this bold idea. Marnie Harmony said it this way, and I will truly end here. I say that we shall never leave the harbor if we do not hoist the sail. I say that we have got to walk the waves as well as the solid ground. I say anyone who goes without consciousness of this will remain chained to a rusty anchor. May the journey find us worthy.